So good morning, everyone. This is Joop Smits from PwC. Welcome to join us for the webinar on the revised Federal Act on Gender Equality. We have about 30 participants, I can see, which is very encouraging. So apparently, amongst this unprecedented crisis, gender equality is still a topic that is on the agenda, which I think something that is already a first important element. So again, my name is Joop Smits. I'm a director in the people and organization business in PwC. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes to speak with you about the Federal Act on Gender Equality. We would like to ask you to save your questions till the end. We will have some time for a Q&A. But I have a question already for the audience to think about over the next 35 minutes or so. And one of the topics I would be very interesting to learn, much interested to learn, is about your opinion on what the impact of COVID-19 will be on gender equality. So the webinar will be hosted by myself, together with Ms. Jasmine Danseisen and Jacques Behrendt. Jasmine and Jacques, do you quickly want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Jasmine, do you want to start?
Yes, with pleasure. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So my name is Jasmine Danseisen. I'm a senior manager within PwC. I wear a double hat. On the one hand, I'm working with clients on the topic of diversity and inclusion and equal pay. And I'm also internally responsible for diversity and inclusion within PwC.
And good morning, everyone. My name is Jacques Behrendt, manager in the P&O team. I also work on the diversity and inclusion service offering we have in the team, but most importantly today, within the team, I am heading the statistical analysis we perform in the context of equal salary certification. And I'm very happy to speak about these statistics and details today with you.
Thank you very much, Jacques and Jasmine. Before we get into the topic of the Federal Act on Equality, we did find it appropriate to spend a couple of moments to think about what the current situation, the current crisis means for our workforces, and why we think and also hope that companies do not forget that diversity and inclusion is a very important element, even in today's circumstances. I mean, the current crisis puts a lot of stress on us as citizens, employees, and as parents. And it's more important than ever to take care of ourselves and the people around us while keeping mentally healthy and well. And what we basically see is that the companies in Switzerland and abroad over the last 3, 4, 5 weeks have rapidly developed all sorts of skills around throughout the workforce, specifically in how to work remotely effectively, flexibly. And in that context, it's also important to make sure that we keep motivated and engaged and mentally resilient in these kind of uncertain times. So one element is indeed the flexibility. Remote working is particularly challenging now. People will have to match the caring responsibilities and the professional responsibilities, and we see that companies are struggling with how to support employees in this perspective. I think also that this new kind of reality requires a new type of leadership and a new type of social behavior. We need to make sure we regularly check in with colleagues. There's, of course, anxiety about job certainty, etc. But also how to be inclusive using technology, how to engage employees in a remote setup, etc., etc. And then the third element, the resilience indeed. Children are at home nowadays. They do follow their school patterns, but in a different way. And parents are involved all of a sudden, not only in fulfilling the job from home office, but also taking care of children. And it's also an additional challenge. So next to this webinar, we will be hosting a series of webinars as of the mid of April that will be driven by our colleague Sue Johnson. Together with Advance, and please stay tuned. We will send you invites around this topic as well. So the topic we'll be discussing is about inclusion, not isolation, how to maintain your personal wellness, dual career parenting, and all kind of elements that are now getting more and more emphasis. Now, today's topic is about the Gender Equality Act, and I think it's also important to realize why equality is even more important today. And lots of companies are getting and understanding more and more and better that actually equality and equal treatment, and specifically gender equality, is an important element, and fairness and equity are fundamental in creating an engaged and high-performing workforce. How can people feel motivated to give the best of themselves if they are not sure whether they get paid the same for doing the same work as their colleagues? I think that's an important element of the gender equality agenda. There is, of course, the reputational risks that companies are facing. Media is actively naming and shaming companies around this topic. Social media is now making news travel very, very fast. But also shareholders and proxy advisors are asking questions on AGMs about this topic. And what we also see is that there's more and more regulatory pressure. More and more countries are actually developing equal pay. And within PwC, we have recently started to investigate gender pay gap legislation developments around the world. We have presented them in the Global Gender Pay Compass, and I will speak a little bit about that just in a bit. The agenda of today, we want to look with you about what is happening in the world and in Switzerland about equal pay legislation. And then we get into the main topic, meaning the Swiss legal requirements. How can companies actually prepare for the new law, and how can they comply with the new law? So that is the bulk of the agenda. And in the wrap-up, we have some time for questions, as I said earlier. So the first question, what is happening in Switzerland? I think it's an important element to if we look at what happens in Switzerland, is to make this distinction between the gender pay gap and the equal pay gap, because we speak about the Equal Pay Gender Equality Act, but it's important to understand the difference between gender pay and equal pay. Gender pay, as defined, being the difference in pay for all male and female employees on average. Which is a good indicator, but the indicator is basically mixing up gender balance challenges and equal pay for equal work challenges. In the UK in 2018, we saw legislation coming in place where companies had to report on gender pay gaps in their companies, and basically that led to a lot of naming and shaming, but it does mix up those two elements of gender balance and gender equal pay for equal work, which doesn't per se help to actually solve the problem. The equal pay gap is a much more fundamental problem, in the sense that it's basically addressing the equal pay for equal work topic. Difference in pay for female and male employees in an organization doing the same or similar work, but at different and making sure that they get paid for that in the same way. Now, this is not something new, and we found it important to bring it to the attention that already in 1948, when there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a couple of years later on the Equal Remuneration Convention of the ILO, the principle of equal pay for equal work has basically been agreed upon by all nations around the world. And it's quite amazing that it's 2020, meaning 60 years later, and we're now actually trying to how to get there. I think it's very encouraging that in the Sustainable Development Goals, number 5, the Sustainable Development Goal number 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, there's specific mention of equal pay for equal work as well. Now, this is indeed the Global Gender Pay Compass that I referred to earlier. We started to develop this in 2018. And there's a couple of important observations to share with you. The first one, I think, is that what we saw when we investigated gender pay gap legislation in about 80 countries in the world is that most of those countries, if not all of those countries, have indeed equal pay for equal work regulations in their constitution or in labor laws. So to start with, it's not something that is exotic. Secondly, a second observation, that not many countries back then in 2018 were actually enforcing these laws very actively. And a third observation interesting to share is that since 2018 we have updated Gender Pay Compass twice, and what we saw in those two updates is that the developments in equal pay laws are quite significant. There's many countries that are basically developing new equal pay laws or regulations to actually enforce existing equal pay laws. Then also, if you see about the difference about equal pay laws around the world, there's a couple of external trends that are interesting to see. The first one, indeed, the external audit, which is also where Switzerland has been heading to or is heading to. Iceland was basically the first country. You must have probably have heard about that. It was the first country where external audits were required. Now, Iceland is not such a big economy. I understand that about 80 companies actually had to comply with that law, so that makes it probably a bit easier to implement, but still interesting. And Switzerland is more or less following that that road. The second one is reporting requirements. So there, the UK, as I mentioned earlier, has been a very important trendsetter in that. Many countries are following the UK example now with gender pay gap reporting. However, what is interesting in terms of the COVID crisis, as I mentioned earlier, is that one of the first measures taken by UK government before imposing confinement was actually to postpone this year's gender pay gap reporting. So I think one of the observations about COVID-19 is already that apparently this was deprioritized in view of many other priorities, let's say, in the UK at that point in time. Another interesting observation, that some countries choose to actually apply penalties for non-compliance with those laws. Other countries don't. In France, there is a quite sophisticated gender pay gap reporting or gender equality index reporting currently in place, where a mix of 5 different factors are used to measure gender equality. And if companies indeed do not meet the thresholds, then there may be a fine of about 1% of the overall payroll, let's say. There's also countries that are imposing employer action plans, for instance, in Belgium, where companies have to disclose a pay analysis, and if the thresholds are not met, then they need to disclose and to develop and disclose an action plan. And there's a lot of other measures. And I think one of the other measures interesting to mention is a couple of states in the United States have decided that specific questions in the recruitment process around current pay levels are not allowed anymore. So those are more, let's say, pragmatic measures to reduce gender pay gap. But the overall message is that gender pay gap legislation is being reinforced, not only in Switzerland, but all over the globe. And this is not something that is going to go away. So companies will have to think about how they will deal with this. So what we see in Switzerland is indeed quite a bit of excitement on the streets as well. Both from pro gender pay gap legislation as well as against gender pay gap legislation. What's important to note is a couple of figures in terms of what is gender pay gap. So the average gender pay gap, and unfortunately this is slightly outdated. This is 2016 data because that's when, let's say, the public office most recent data made available by the public office, but an 18% gender pay gap. So that is an average gender pay gap is in the Swiss economy, of which a large part can actually not be explained. So 7.7% gender pay gap today in Switzerland for men and women doing the same work, but thus not getting the same pay. And a lot of companies that we are working with, they always tell us that we probably don't have a gender pay gap here. We've got it under control. The question then, of course, if all the companies have the gender pay gap under control, then where do these figures come from? Let's get more into the details about the Swiss requirements of the Gender Equality Act. So going back a little bit in history, we see that actually the Gender Equality Act already came into force in 1996, so that is almost 25 years ago. Then there was a period, quite a long period of about 18 years, where there was, as we call it, a voluntary implementation of the constitutional obligations, and there was a dialogue ongoing between the social partners about how actually gender equality could be enforced and how gender pay gaps could be reduced. Basically, there was at one point the Federal Council basically did an impact assessment a couple of years ago to see where now this was going, this voluntary implementation. And the outcomes, to cut it very short, were that the gender pay gap had hardly reduced over that period. And thus the decision was taken to actually reinforce the measures. So I find it important to share this with you for let's say, those people that believe indeed that liberalism and do not enforcing a more stringent act is a way to go. That has been tried and tested and it didn't work. So it has some sort of a reason why this Gender Equality Act is now being revised. Based on that, the Gender Equality Act itself has had a small change, but more importantly is actually the change that was then developed in the ordinance. So the Constitution itself in Switzerland mentions equal pay in Article 8, Paragraph 3. It basically tells that men and women have equal rights, and that basically men and women have the right to equal pay for equal work or work of equal value. Then the Gender Equality Act has indeed a new paragraph 4a, which describes the equal salary analysis and the external review. So there we get into the technicalities about how actually equal pay can be reinforced. And Switzerland has chosen for the external review or the external audit. And then the question is always, how do we actually put it in place? And for that purpose, a ordinance was published in August 2019, and the ordinance is basically regulating the different details about how companies need to comply with that law. Now, here are a couple of highlights of the law, of the new equal pay ordinance. Basically, the objective is to realize equal pay between women and men. It's about assessing whether systemic gender-based discrimination in organizations and taking then the necessary steps to actually mitigate them. And then a third point, extremely important, having the equal pay analysis reviewed by a qualified external auditor. And why is it important? I think it's one reason is that basically an equal pay analysis is not that easy. There's a lot of elements that need to be chosen to actually include or exclude. And what we've seen in the UK, for instance, that when the gender pay gap reporting was launched in the first year, that about 30% of those gender pay gap reports were actually incorrect. I don't think that companies were appropriately or purposely making incorrect statements, but because of the complexity and the unclarity about how to actually deal with this, there was just a lot of discrepancy about the interpretation of the law. So having an external auditor in place will simply help to make sure that the data that goes in the analysis is actually also the data that's in the payroll system, and also that there's a consistent approach about how gender pay gaps are being calculated. The scope of the audit means that it only applies to companies that have 100 employees, which includes full-time and part-time employees, apprentices as well. Apprentices and contract workers are excluded. For those companies that have expatriates, also expatriates that are sent abroad are excluded. There was some discussion to have at one point this law applied to companies with 50 employees or more, but it was decided to apply it to this to 100 employees and more, which basically means that a large part of the Swiss working population is concerned, but a very small part of the Swiss companies are concerned, because a lot of the companies are smaller than 100 employees. So the smaller companies are basically exempt from this, let's call it an administrative burden or compliance burden, whereas at the same time, a large part of the workers in Switzerland are still in scope. So it is a bit of a trade-off between applicability of a law and having a real impact. So the time frame of the law is that basically a company needs to do the analysis every 4 years. However, there's no sanctions that are imposed in case a company is not able to demonstrate that there is no gender pay gap. Now, the big sanction is basically the reputational risk, because companies are obliged to share the outcomes of the gender pay gap with their employees. And of course, no company wants to tell their employees that actually they have a high gender pay gap. Also, companies that are listed, they need to inform shareholders about the gender pay gap outcomes. There are exceptions for companies beyond the earlier mentioned threshold of 100 employees. One is that if companies show that equal pay analysis is indeed, if equal pay analysis indeed shows that there is compliance with the new law, then companies are exempt from that requirement to redo the analysis every 4 years. Of course, if companies are decreasing below the number of 100, then also they are exempt. And there's a third element which is also interesting, that basically in Switzerland there was already companies were already asked to provide gender pay gap analysis in view of public procurement processes. So companies that have been undergoing those specific audits in the past, they could also be exempt. Now, then one of the most important questions is actually, how do you now demonstrate equal pay for equal work? And in that equation, it is less difficult to determine what pay is. Then we just need to define which elements are included in the term pay. But the question is, how do you determine equal work? And that is actually not such an easy question to answer. And for that purpose, basically, there is a tool that has been developed by the federal government, the LOGIP tool. It is a tool that is standard and freely downloadable from the website. But in the law, it also is written that companies can actually use methodology other than LOGIP, as long as it is scientifically and legally approved methodology. And from that perspective, we know that the equal salary methodology is also has also received the confirmation from an independent institute that it is indeed recognized as scientific and legally a scientific and legal tool. So in this presentation, we will further explain to you the difference, or both methodologies, and the difference between both methodologies as well. So here a small timeline about how now the new law looks like. So the law comes in place the 1st of July 2020, so in a couple of months. Then basically companies have 12 months to conduct an internal analysis on salary equality, using indeed one of the methodologies that is recognized as such under the new law. Then after that period, the company needs to opt for needs to make sure that that analysis gets audited. Basically, the audit needs to be done within 12 months after the internal analysis has been done. And the internal analysis will be done on a specific month in that 12-month period. So companies need to choose a specific month. We call it the reference month. And in that month, they need to take the data from that month and do an equal pay analysis. So basically, once that the audit has been done, the result needs to be disclosed to employees and, if listed, also shareholders. And in case the outcomes are not sufficiently positive, then then basically the company needs to redo the analysis every 4 years. Now I want to hand over to my colleague Jasmine, who will explain us a little bit on how companies can actually prepare for the new law.
Super. Thank you very much, Joop. So we've heard about the context of the new regulatory requirements in Switzerland, the multiplication also of regulations, not only also abroad, in addition to what's happening in Switzerland, and also the increased public demand on the topic. Now, what does this mean for your organization, and how can companies make sure they're ready for the new law? We see this as basically consisting of 3 levels that build up quite nicely upon each other, on which you can take action. So first of all, it's really about making sure that you have your own house in order. So this means that having the right policies in place, but also the right practices. Then you may want to self-assess where you stand, so understand where you are. And finally, you also may want to get an external view on the measures you've put in place. So on the next slides, we will focus on what you can do within your organization, and we will then move on to the more self-assessment type of approach, as well as the external verification in the next section of our webcast with Jacques, and I'll hand then over when we get there. Thank you very much for changing the slides. Yep. So a helpful way to approach equal pay or D&I interventions in your organization is to look at the employee life cycle. That's really as the basis of the interventions at the various stages of the cycle. So questions here are, what are you already doing to mitigate bias in your organization to ensure there is equal treatment and also equal opportunity? And what do actually your current policies and practices say? Another aspect that's very important is what are your employees' perception on these practices? What do your employees think about fairness and equality within your organizations? You may have an employee resource group within your organization that you can involve also to gauge that perception. Or if you run employee satisfaction surveys, the question is, do you also include questions around gender equality, around the perception of equal pay within your organization? And also, once you get the result, a useful tool is also to assess actually the results by gender split to see how the different points of view may or may not differ. We see this quite regularly also in the work with our clients. One thing is to have policies in place. The other is then how are they lived and applied in the organization, and how consistently they're applied. And also the discrepancy between the two can be quite significant, which also then of course fuels the perception of the employees and also may have an impact on the gender pay gap. Looking at the employee life cycle at the hiring stage. So this is a stage that is quite critical in the context of equal pay. We've heard it before around the states in the US that are taking measures when it comes to the recruitment stage. So we often see robust equal pay policies in place, also strong analysis done in the compensation cycle. However, the pay gap creeps in already at the hiring stage, and especially with the question around salary expectations. Here, we know that women tend to go rather a bit lower in than men, and that really sets a basis for unequal pay already from the very beginning. So you may have clear policies in place around salary progression within the organization, but then if the salary starts unequally, there is a risk that a certain gap will remain and will not be fully corrected during the normal career progression within the company. So we notice a trend in the companies we work with that the question about salary expectation is not asked anymore, and that also avoids at this base this bias already creeps in at this very first stage of the employee life cycle. A key other stage to focus on from an equal pay perspective is the performance process. This is typically where employees particularly perceive most inequality. A study by McKinsey and Lean In revealed that we tend to overestimate men's performance and underestimate women's. And this means that as a result, men are often hired and promoted based on their potential, while women tend to be hired and promoted rather based on their track record. So lower performance, of course, also means less pay increase, and that then also results in a pay gap. Good practices in the performance management process include, for instance, having a neutral observer in your talent discussions, and also analyzing proposed ratings, so before they're finalized by gender. Training HR managers on these topics, but also very importantly line managers on topics such as unconscious bias. there is often a saying that women ask less for a pay rise compared to men, and that this is one of the reasons why there is a pay gap. Latest research, however, shows that women ask as often as men, but are unfortunately less successful. So women are asking for promotions and raises at about the same rate as men. But for every 100 men, this study found, promoted to manager, only 79 women are. So that's quite speaking. You may move to the next slide. So having robust guidelines, policies, practices in place, and also checking for the perception of these allows you to have quite a solid base. Exactly. But another important aspect is also to actually run your own analysis and do data analysis. So to understand your potential pay gap, an obvious choice is, of course, to analyze compensation data. For instance, the average or median salary split by gender, salary by grade and gender, but also data points along the employee life cycle at hiring. Here, not only at hiring, but even before at the application level. Then also performance ratings and promotions by gender, training, so access to learning and development by gender, as well as the budget allocated to training. More advanced organization on the topic today work with interactive analytics, so that links to the HR system within the organization to monitor a set of KPIs in real time. And these companies then also use data analytics to predict how the pay gap, but also other D&I KPIs evolve, considering certain interventions at the different stages in the employee life cycle, at the hiring, at promotion, but also taking into account your effective and predicted attrition rate. Going to the next slide, this is the equality dashboard tool that we've put in place and are implementing with a number of organizations now. So this is one way to visualize your data in an interactive way. Our clients find dashboards particularly useful to explain and to have the narrative around the company's D&I maturity, to point towards issues with concrete data and evidence in conversations with the leadership and with business, and also then to determine actions on how to address them. So it's a helpful tool to make, but also to sustain the business case for D&I within your organization. So to sum it up, and before we go for a deeper dive into the pay gap and how to analyze it, just to briefly summarize, so we spoke about the levels of intervention. So one, at the first level, the company needs to make sure to have your own house in order, having strong HR policies, processes, practices in place, assessing your HR indicators as part of your dashboard regularly. We briefly mentioned that one side is to have the policies, the other is the implementation. So training line managers to effectively apply these policies and practices is critical. We often see with our clients that most of them struggle with line manager effectiveness. So how to make sure that the processes are applied consistently, effectively, and that the values of the organizations are lived. And the second is, of course, communication, the importance to raise awareness of your efforts to your employees. So we see that with the most advanced companies that are struggling in this aspect, there is a lot of work done by HR in the background, but the employees' awareness is limited. So regularly gauging that employees' perception complements the D&I data and dashboard that you have and that you analyze on a regular basis. So the second aspect is the self-evaluation that you can run with a tool such as Logip, for instance, or you may then also go strive towards having an external validation through an audit or a certification. And I'll hand over here to Jacques to give you a bit more details on these two steps.
Thank you, Jasmine. So in the next section, we'll dive into the methodology that is required for organizations to demonstrate that they comply with the law, that they ensure equal pay for equal work. So basically, the general idea is to determine how much of pay is explained by gender, all things being equal, which means ensuring that men and women receive equal pay for equal work. To determine this, It is required that you use a methodology that is scientific. In most cases, you will be using regression analysis, which includes a set of predictors that have an impact on pay. What we mean when we speak of predictors of pay, so you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, you could want to use personal data such as gender, of course, age, education level, years of service, training, but also professional data. This is data related to people's function, skill level, professional position, and other predictors could be considered as well, department, role, work location, etc. All these variables that could potentially have an impact on pay might at some point be included in the analysis. And you will want to determine how these elements impact on pay as understood in a very broad sense. So we're talking about base salary, 13th salary, bonuses, any allowance, special payments. It is a broad definition of pay that we have and that we want to use in the analysis. The analysis will be performed on a reference month. So according to the law, this reference month must be selected as of July 2020. We will, and this analysis control for occupation rate, of course. This is also taken into account. And according to the law, all employees are subject to the analysis, should be taken into account, except for apprentices and contracted workers who have a very different relationship with the organization. So on the next slide, we just wanted to show very briefly that to date, and as far as we know, there are two methodologies that can be used, have been recognized, LOGIB, of course, developed by the Confederation, and the Equal Salary Certification. Both of these methodologies are, according to the law, scientific and legally compliant. So we will explain a little bit of the differences between the two. First of all, the LOGIB analysis and its characteristics. For those companies who want to use LOGIB, there will be several steps to follow. First, you need to identify all the elements required by the analysis. This is predictors, elements of pay. But what is very peculiar about this LOGIB analysis is that you will actually have to perform some sort of internal job evaluation exercise. You will have to go through all the functions you have, all the roles you've identified that you're using in your organization. And for every one of these functions, you will have to assess them against two predefined dimensions. First of which is skill level, second which is professional position. We'll come back to this later, but it's just to let you know already at this stage that you need, in order to prepare for this analysis, you need to go through this exercise before anything. Once you've done this, you prepare the data, convert it, so that you can implement it in the LOGIB tool, and then it's quite easy, all automated. You run the analysis, and LOGIB produces the main results. You could use them to draft a report. Now, if we want to turn to the next slide and see a little bit some details about the data used in LOGIB. So this is, we can see on the first picture, an excerpt of the documentation that you have access to on the internet. So you can see what is required in terms of personal data, workplace data, work time percentage, wage, etc. And again, it's important here to stress that when it comes to workplace data and every function you have in your organization, you'll have to assess these functions against these two dimensions, skill levels and professional positions. And we've showed in the next couple of pictures here that should appear. This skill level is broken down into 4 levels. This is basically how demanding the job, the function would be, 4 different levels to be distinguished. And when it comes to professional position, this is more about the hierarchical level that every function would be related to, and there are 5 different positions here. So you need to stick to this framework. You need to format your data in such a way that basically you fit into the LOGIB model that is predefined, and the analysis then will be run with this. The purpose of this is so that the analysis itself only uses a set of predictors that are considered gender neutral, but at the same time, this also means that you will have to do a little bit of work to prepare for the analysis in Logib. So now if we move on to the methodology used in the context of the equal salary certification. So here things are a little bit different. The analysis itself is tailored to the reality of the company, which means that we will be using mostly the variables and predictors of pay that are most relevant to the company, that are used actually by the company. So basically all you have to do is to identify the elements we want to throw into the model, use in the analysis. This would be simply for the organization. This would simply mean that you need to look into your payroll system, HR data, and provide us with the data that you use to determine pay. Simply put, share an Excel file with us. We identify again all the elements that are necessary to conduct the analysis. And once we're comfortable with the extensiveness of these variables, we perform the analysis and report on its outcomes. So on the next slide, we'll see also some examples of the variables that are used. Of course, these are only an example. But again, the idea of this methodology is that it's tailored to the company's reality, and many companies also appreciate this, because for some it might seem more meaningful. The outcomes of the analysis might speak a bit more to the people who are interested in the results, especially because they are based on an analysis that is tailored to the reality of the company. So you would see the variables we could take into account as predictors on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, it's more about the elements of pay. This is pretty similar to what the Logib analysis would do, but most important here is that there's much less work also for an organization going through this process, much less work, and the methodology and the model is much closer to the reality of the company's remuneration policy. Okay, so on the next slide, we also wanted just to illustrate that the analysis performed in the context of the equal salary certification is an analysis on salaries, but actually the certification itself entails a much more in-depth analysis of what is happening in the company in terms of gender equality. It's not all about equal pay. We also perform an on-site audit to ensure that the company is caring about gender equality, has the right processes in place to make sure that the company can assess the situation, improve the situation in terms of gender equality. And this is, in a very broad sense, all along the employee life cycle. We'll be looking at equal pay, of course, but also equal opportunities, performance management, and all these elements that are related to the employee life cycle and we've identified earlier. So coming back to the legislation in Switzerland, what will happen after the analysis is performed is that this analysis will be audited, reviewed by a certified auditor, which will check the timing of the analysis, the methodology used, the completeness and accuracy of the data set. And then we, as an auditor, will prepare a report, which will have to be issued within the year following the reference month that was used for the analysis. So if you use the data from July 2020, you'll have to have this report issued by June 2021. So this is what will happen with the data and the analysis once it has been produced. And this is a necessary step for you to comply with the law.
Thank you very much, Jacques, and Jasmine as well. So we have come to the end of the WebEx, the webcast. I understand that there's one question which maybe Jacques you want to answer. It's about to which extent are interns or trainees part of the process?
Yeah, so it is explained in the documentation provided by the Confederation on Logib. It is also the case for the equal salary certification, that we consider in the analysis all the people that are subject to a similar remuneration policy. And there are some people, contract workers or apprentices, for instance, who are subject to very different treatment. These people, by definition, are to be excluded from the analysis. There's a case in both methodologies, both logic and equal salary. Trainees, I believe it will be the same, and I think because also they're subject to a different remuneration policy and very specific contract, these should be also excluded from the analysis.
Thank you very much, Jacques. So I understand there are no other questions. If so, please post it on the chat function in the webcast. Maybe to wrap it up, so the new law comes into place July 2020 for all companies with at least 100 employees or more. There are some specificities, for instance, for holding companies that are listed, that have different affiliates with that are employing entities. So there are some technicalities that may be applicable to your organizations. Please, if you have any questions around that, then we're happy to help you with that. So there are some discussions in the National Council to further strengthen this law. For this moment, these are just discussions and ideas. One of the discussions is to indeed widen the scope so that also companies with 50+ employees are reported. Another topic that has been proposed or discussed is to blacklist companies who are actually unable to demonstrate equal pay. And there's also been a discussion proposal about fining companies if they indeed do not manage to demonstrate equal pay. So this is it from our end. Many thanks for joining this webcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you took away something interesting. And if you have anything that you would like to share with us, then do not hesitate and get into contact with us. If you would like to have a copy of the slides, and also please reach out to either to Natasha, who sent you the invite, or to someone from the presenters, and we will share with you the slides. Thank you very much, and have an excellent lunch. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.